We want all aspects surrounding this issue to be brought out into the light of day so we can make a full and complete assessment of this issue. On one side, I am not saying that these men took these actions because they knew Srila Prabhupada wanted a Ritvik system and they chose to lie to us because they wanted to become gurus. That is what many jumped to the wrong conclusion and thought. No, the evidence does not support that. These men genuinely thought that Srila Prabhupada wanted the 11 men he selected to become actual gurus on his disappearance. That is what they genuinely thought at the time. While they weren't as sinister as some mistakenly thought, they were no pure white saints either. They jumped to all the wrong conclusions and thought it was Prabhupada in his foolishly written letter that would mislead everyone, when they were the ones who misled themselves and now misled all of Srila Prabhupada's mission. In other words, their mentality was they knew better than Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada had written this letter such that it was the exact message and the exact instructions that he wanted his followers to know and understand. But these GBC men foolishly thought that they knew better than Srila Prabhupada. They knew better than he did. They knew that the words he wrote were bad and misleading. They knew it was better for ISKCON and better for even Prabhupada that they disobey Prabhupada and make sure that no one else other than themselves have access to and can read this letter. This shows us how immature these men were at the time, how very much they were still conditioned souls subject to illusion and mistakes, and also subject to all bad judgment and offensive actions. It is never a good thing to deliberately disobey the genuine Acharya. Nothing good will ever come of that. Before I move on, I know this is going on over and over, the same thing again and again, but what these men did was so disturbing. I just have to reiterate this from a slightly different perspective and say a few more things about this letter. As I've explained, Srila Prabhupada was so weak at the time, yet he took the time and effort to make sure that this letter said exactly what he wanted it to say. We must know that this was his one and only and final written and signed instructions on the topic of initiations for the future, as he used the word henceforward in the letter. In the main presentation, I will give indisputable evidence that Srila Prabhupada clearly indicates in the letter itself that this letter describes the system for after he departs. But even if you insist on arguing that he only wanted these men to act as Ritvik while he was present, still, this was his letter that he wrote for us, his followers, to read at that time. It doesn't matter on which side of this issue you stand on, the mindset and decisions and the actions of these GBC men took were wrong and offensive. His divine grace wanted that letter, as it was written when he signed it, to be read and understood by all his disciples at that time. These GBC men committed a grave offense by disobeying him and keeping this letter from us then and for so many years later. What they did, they must atone for. The GBC as a body must atone for what the GBC of 1977 did. Even in 1985, it wasn't that the GBC decided it was time to share this letter with us. Rather, a devotee had to sneak it out of the BBT and made copies, and slowly devotees got access to it, which at the time was still against what the GBC wanted. They wanted to keep this away from us. It's way past time for the followers of Srila Prabhupada to know the real history of what really happened surrounding this Ritvik Guru issue. It is the only way to really understand what Srila Prabhupada really wanted. Everyone needs to be aware of the real truth and the whole story. So from 1986 to 87 and onward, as devotees began to read this letter for the very first time, more and more devotees were convinced that this Ritvik system was the system that Srila Prabhupada actually wanted us to follow. And that this multi-guru system that the GBC have been following is actually bogus and not at all what he wanted. And this is exactly what the GBC feared what would happen if devotees were allowed to actually read what Srila Prabhupada wanted us to read. Well, damn it, it is what Srila Prabhupada wrote, and it is exactly what he wanted his followers to read and to understand at that time, and now as well. By understanding this incident in this way, it gives us a totally different perspective than how the GBC have always presented this. They will state that it is the multi-guru path, is the path that Srila Prabhupada wanted, and that the supporters of the Ritvik system, they are the offensive, the deviant, and the disobedient devotees. When the real reality, the real fact is that the very basis of their system is marred with proven and gross offensive actions, deliberate, gross disobedience by none other than leading members of the GBC themselves. They were the ones who deviated and disobeyed and offended Srila Prabhupada. Sadly, the GBC men at that time didn't even consider that is what their actions were doing. And even more sadly, the GBC still does not accept this. It is long past time for the current members of the GBC to wake up and face the reality of this. Another consideration is that this is the only document, this July 9th letter is the only document that Srila Prabhupada signed since the May 28th meeting that dealt with initiations for the future. This is the only instruction he gave in writing with his signature as to the duties he had assigned those 11 men regarding initiations. The only thing he had authorized them to do was to become his Ritvik representative. If he had wanted them to become actual gurus later on, he would have written this himself in that same letter. The GBC have always shrugged these arguments off as of being of absolutely no importance. The same way the GBC in 1977 shrugged off Srila Prabhupada's letter at the time as if being of no importance. That attitude is totally unacceptable. And if the current GBC don't own up to this, it's time to demand a new GBC. The real reason these men chose to ban Prabhupada's July 9th letter was because they thought that Srila Prabhupada wanted the people, the men on that list, that letter, to be gurus. And they feared that this letter would mislead the devotees into thinking Prabhupada really didn't want them to be. Then, as I've asked, did they decide to disobey Srila Prabhupada and prevent this letter from being read by all the devotees because they thought it was in the best interest for ISKCON and Prabhupada, or because they thought it was in the best interest for them? Srila Prabhupada never requested any other document to be written. He never dictated any other letter. He never signed any other paper on this topic or regarding these men, where he stated in writing with his signature that these men were to become actual gurus. For this introduction, I just wanted to give the brief understanding as to what this real issue is about, and a taste of what the main presentation will be like. One more thing, however, before I move on. Let's just imagine for a minute and play a game called What If? What if the GBC had actually obeyed Srila Prabhupada's order and sent the July 9th letter out to all the temples in July of 1977? For certain, most of the temple presidents would have shared this with all the devotees at their temple. Most certainly, at least a good number of the temple presidents and other senior devotees would have come to the conclusion, as the GBC feared they would, that when His Divine Grace wrote that this was to be the system henceforward, they would have taken this to be the system Srila Prabhupada wanted for after he departs. And this is the very point the GBC men feared would have happened. But why would that have been a bad thing? It would not have been a bad thing at all, no matter which side you stand on this issue. Coming to that conclusion, that this is what he wanted for after he departs, this would have sparked open conversation among all the devotees, which is most likely what Srila Prabhupada wanted in the first place. A number of his senior devotees and temple presidents would have had this conversation with their local GBC men, asking them for confirmation. Is this the system that we're to follow after Srila Prabhupada departs? Let's also assume that the GBC men would have at that point then informed these senior devotees that this letter was not Srila Prabhupada's only instruction on this matter. They would have informed the temple presidents that on May 28th, Srila Prabhupada gave verbal instructions, which the GBC had understood that Srila Prabhupada wanted that these men would become regular gurus. Since the July 9th letter gave the names of these 11 men, then at that time the temple presidents would have known in July that, at least according to the GBC, Srila Prabhupada had wanted those 11 men to have become his successor gurus. They would have known that the likes of Hansadutta, Jayatirtha, Bhavananda, Rameshwara, etc., that they were to become the next acharyas in our line. After all, that is what the GBC had concluded. So they would have now been forced to have shared that understanding with the temple presidents and the other senior disciples, rather than keeping this all to themselves and keeping it all secret until after Srila Prabhupada leaves and then just springing it on us. But it is absolutely certain that when the temple presidents and senior devotees were told that these men were now to become the next acharyas, that a number of devotees would have certainly objected, or at the very least, they would have expressed their grave concern. They would have pressed the GBC for more than just their word that this is what the GBC thought Srila Prabhupada had said. Remember, at the time, the GBC wasn't able to produce any actual quote of what Srila Prabhupada did say in the May 28th meeting. All they had were the notes that one of them had wrote down from what he remembered and what he thought Srila Prabhupada had said. But the temple presidents would have demanded real solid evidence that this was really what Srila Prabhupada wanted, especially because the character of some of these men at the time were, well, shall we say, questionable? As I've already noted, there is the conversation in April of 1977, just 1 month before the May 28th meeting, where Tamal Krishna is telling Srila Prabhupada that he has assessed himself and all of Srila Prabhupada's disciples, and he told Srila Prabhupada that he knows he's not qualified to become guru, and he knows no one else was either at that time. That's just 2.5 months before the July 9th letter was written. Prabhupada agreed with his assessment. This was Tamal's own assessment of himself and all of Prabhupada's disciples at the time, and His Divine Grace agreed. For some of the temple presidents to have reached that same conclusion at that time, just 2.5 months later after Tamal had reached the same conclusion, that would have been understandable. That was their educated understanding, just as it was for Tamal's. So for me to say that there would have been temple presidents or other senior devotees who would have thought the same as Tamal Krishna and Prabhupada did at that time, it is not far-fetched, and it has nothing to do with anyone being envious. So yes, it is absolutely certain, without a doubt, that a significant number of senior devotees would have pressed the GBC to go back and ask Srila Prabhupada for a written and signed statement, a letter like the July 9th letter, stating that those same 11 men were to become actual gurus as soon as he physically departed this world. If that had happened, there would never have been an issue regarding this. Either Srila Prabhupada would have written and signed such a document, or he would have told them that that was not at all what he had said in May, and that it was not at all what he wants. He would have told them he had already detailed the system he wants in the July 9th letter. Either way, the issue would have been fully settled. So no matter which side you're on, no matter how you interpret the letter in the May 28th meeting, the actions by those GBC men were not only offensive and wrong, but they are the real cause that this entire issue was not properly resolved in Srila Prabhupada's presence. The real blame for this whole controversy doesn't lie with the so-called disgruntled, bitter, or envious disciples of Srila Prabhupada. The blame lies directly at the feet of those GBC men who chose to deliberately disobey Srila Prabhupada's order. And they had done so because they thought they knew better than His divine grace. The blame rests in their disobedience, their offensive attitudes, and their offensive actions towards Srila Prabhupada. It is time for the GBC members to own up to those deplorable and offensive actions of its past members, or their own past. If they can't bring themselves to do this, then it is time for the devotees to replace the GBC with a new GBC who will. It is time for the real truth and the real story to be told.